Thank you for joining us today as we take a look at Chapter 20, Part 1, Gilded Age Politics. And what we see develop in politics is that the Democratic and Republican parties really solidify their base, and there's intense voter loyalty as people rarely shifted kind of loyalties from one party to the other. And so politics really came down to competing for a handful of doubtful states, places like New York, Illinois, even Ohio, and several others. And relatively few in numbers, these states would prove to be invaluable as they would swing elections one way or the other. In fact, what we see in several elections kind of during this era, in 1876 and 1888, whoever won the popular vote actually lost the election because they had less electoral votes. And so it really came down to a couple key battleground states, as most of these elections were kind of decided by less than 1% of the popular vote. Now, the Democratic Party during this time, you see, might have enjoyed more widespread support throughout the United States, whereas the Republican Party was almost more of a sectional party. But what appealed to many Americans for the Democratic Party was their belief in states' rights. Now, obviously, this was an issue that goes way back to the Founding Fathers, kind of split us during the Civil War, and it's still something that was argued during this time. And even yet today, it still is, too. But the states' rights believers kind of wanted more of a decentralized government, one that wasn't so powerful, kind of more of a limited government. Oftentimes, the Democratic Party would also want lower tariffs, as their constituents or voting bloc would come from the South and Southwest agrarian societies that had usually frowned upon high tariffs. Other groups that might tend to vote Democratic would be immigrants and maybe the working poor, which sometimes would see job competition from free African Americans and resent that, or just wanted kind of a less role of a government in their lives as well. Conversely, the Republican Party, partially because of their stance on civil rights, you think about the party of Lincoln that abolished slavery and granted civil rights and voting rights to African Americans, as well as their military rule of the South during Reconstruction, really kind of lost favor in the South, and therefore is more of a sectional party with Northern support. But the Republican Party also kind of looked at issues differently. They thought that the role of the government was to try to promote moral progress and material wealth. They wanted to do this by kind of increasing the role of government, having the government try to spur on the economy, maybe by passing those high protective tariffs that we've talked about in the past, giving subsidies for railroads to help them build across the nation, and also by passing civil rights legislation. Now, tariffs sometimes split the Republican Party. Most probably tend to try to favor higher tariffs, but there was a wing that also wanted to try to lower them, something we'll take a look at in future lessons. But this tended then to create wide support in the North, especially to help their industry and wealthy industrialists who favor those higher tariffs. It would draw support from African Americans, obviously, for the support of civil rights, but it also drew support from the northern states out west because of having issued things like the Homestead Act and the Transcontinental Railroad that was built, and other things like that would kind of keep support from those northern states out west as well. And being that there was more population in the north, the Republicans are able to win many times the presidential race, as you can see here. Rutherford B. Hayes, when he defeated Samuel Tilden in 1876, which ended basically Reconstruction. You've got Garfield, Harrison, and McKinley, all Republican presidents, split up by Grover Cleveland, who was the only president to be voted in twice to office in non-consecutive terms, as you can see in 1884 and again in 1892. However, as you can see, two of those Republican presidents were assassinated in office. Garfield after his 1880 election, and Chester A. Arthur, his vice president, then became president, and William McKinley in his second term, which then led to Teddy Roosevelt becoming president. And as you can see, with such competition and kind of the entertainment value of politics, voter turnout was extremely high during the late 1800s. But even though people that could vote turned out, it was still kind of relegated to white males. Because except for out in some western states, women were still denied the right to vote, and African Americans were having their vote suppressed more and more through different laws like the poll tax, where they had to pay a yearly tax. Anybody did who wanted to vote had to pay a yearly tax to be able to vote, or literacy tests, which tested people's ability to read and interpret perhaps the Constitution, or the 8-box, which you would have to require to be literate to know where to place your ballots. All of these measures meant to try to keep African Americans from voting. Nevertheless, though, what we see kind of develop during this era and kind of characterize the time period is the fact that after Andrew Johnson's impeachment process during Reconstruction, the president really kind of lost strength to Congress. And so the role of the president kind of was diminished as people kind of got tired of big government and Reconstruction and shifted their attention away from Washington and to the states and local governments to kind of take on more responsibilities and to solve local issues. And what we see then too is kind of the rise of party politics in these states, where party machinery often was kind of dominated by certain individuals like Roscoe Conkling of New York, who kind of believed in the spoils system and kind of dominated New York politics. But you see kind of a disagreement then between some of these state leaders, kind of trying to win over more power at the expense of the federal government then. But with that said, you can see the 1880 results here, the presidential election, which will see James Garfield win it and kind of enter the White House with kind of basically sole support of those northern and midwestern states. Now, Garfield wanted to try to unite the Republican Party as the issue of tariffs was kind of still splitting them, and he actually wanted to try to lower the tariffs. However, in July of 1881, shortly after taking office, he was shot by Charles Guiteau and eventually died later that year in September. Now, Guiteau was kind of somebody who was looking to be appointed to office, was upset that he wasn't given a position. But after the assassination of Garfield, his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, will become president, and he'll kind of continue the work to lower the tariff and do so in 1883. But with the assassination of Garfield by somebody who was upset that they weren't appointed to a position in government, one of the accomplishments of Arthur is the fact that the Pendleton Act was passed, which set up the Civil Service Commission, which dealt then with kind of how jobs in government were given out. Instead of just kind of using the spoils system that you could give them to supporters or certain people, it set up the Civil Service exam, which would base jobs being obtained through merit rather than just simple appointments. And the thought was to try to get it so that you didn't upset people and prevent further assassinations in the future. But we'll continue our look at the Gilded Age as we progress through our next two lessons here as well.